Every year, 200,000 pilgrims walk to one grave in Spain. They cross mountains, rivers, and 800 kilometers of open road, all to reach the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela. The cathedral is Spain's most sacred building. Inside it, under the high altar, are bones the Catholic Church says belong to St. James. St. James the Apostle, one of the 12 original disciples of Jesus Christ. Spain built its most powerful national myth around this single claim. The Reconquista, the expulsion of the Moors, centuries of holy war, all of it powered by the belief that Spain's patron saint was buried on Spanish soil. But scientists tested the bones under that altar, and the results are a problem because the bones inside Santiago Cathedral don't belong to one person. They belong to at least 3. And not one of those individuals has been dated to the 1st century. So who is actually buried under Spain's most famous cathedral? To answer that, you have to go back 1,200 years to a hillside in the far northwest corner of the Iberian Peninsula. In the year 829, a hermit named Pelayo reported something extraordinary. He said he had followed a trail of lights in the sky to a forgotten burial site. The site would become known as Campus Stelli, the Field of Stars. Bishop Theodomir of Iria Flavia declared the bones to be those of St. James. No inscription confirmed this. No document connected the site to any apostle. The bishop's word was the only evidence, but it was enough. Within decades, a church was built over the site, and then pilgrims began to arrive. First dozens, then hundreds, then tens of thousands every year. The church became a cathedral. The cathedral became a destination, and the destination became the foundation of Spain's national identity. Kings invoked St. James before battle. Soldiers shouted his name as a war cry. Santiago Matamoros, St. James the Moorslayer, became the symbol of Christian Spain. For 700 years of holy war, those bones justified everything. Before every major battle, the generals prayed to Santiago. His image appeared on coins, royal seals, and military banners across the peninsula. Scene 30C video, photorealistic, cinematic documentary style matching reference image. Medium shot of a medieval stone cathedral interior where a robed king kneels before the altar receiving a sword from a bishop. Courtiers standing in solemn witness behind them. Warm amber candlelight from dozens of candles. Cameras slowly orbiting around the ceremony. Incense, smoke drifting. Dramatic medieval atmosphere. Film grain texture coronations invoked his blessing. Treaties were sworn in his name. But modern science doesn't care about national myths. It only cares about what the bones themselves can tell us. The first major finding came from forensic anthropology. When anatomists examined the contents of the reliquary beneath the cathedral altar, they found bones that could not have come from one body. Duplicate skeletal elements, bones of different sizes and stages of development. At least 3 separate people had their remains mixed into one silver chest. The church acknowledged this, but their explanation raised more questions. In 1884, Pope Leo XIII issued a papal bull declaring the relics authentic. The investigation behind that declaration was conducted with the tools of the 1880s. No radiocarbon dating, no DNA extraction, no isotope analysis, visual inspection by physicians who were invited by the church itself. Modern researchers have tried to do better. Radiocarbon dating can determine when a person died within a range of decades. Isotope analysis can reveal where someone lived and what they ate. And ancient DNA extraction can identify biological sex, ancestry, and kinship. If these bones belong to a 1st century Galilean fisherman, the science would confirm it. James, the son of Zebedee, was a fisherman from Galilee. According to the Gospels, he was one of the first followers Jesus called. The book of Acts records his execution clearly. The book of Acts describes James's death in a single sentence: killed by the sword in Jerusalem, No mention of travel, no mention of Spain. Scene 50C, talking head. The character says, if James had preached across the entire Mediterranean, someone would have written it down. If James had preached across the entire Mediterranean, someone would have written it down. Scene 50D, video. Photorealistic cinematic documentary style matching reference image. Wide shot of a university library special collections reading room. Researchers at desks examining ancient manuscripts under individual reading lamps. Floor-to-ceiling dark wood shelving filled with leather-bound volumes. Warm amber overhead chandeliers. Camera slowly tracking past the researchers. Scholarly silence, warm rich tones. Film grain texture Paul's letters mention journeys across the Roman world in exhaustive detail. Scene 50E, image, photorealistic, cinematic, documentary style matching reference image. Close up of a scholarly map showing the documented missionary journeys of Paul across the Mediterranean. Colored routes tracing from Jerusalem through Asia Minor to Greece and Rome. Displayed on a researcher's desk beside a map of Spain, showing no documented apostolic visits. Cold overhead fluorescent lighting subject positioned left of frame. Deep focus, neutral color palette. High detail vertical bar pan right. A 4,000-kilometer journey to Spain would have been extraordinary and completely undocumented. Herod Agrippa had James killed by the sword in Jerusalem around 44 AD. He died in Jerusalem. Every biblical scholar agrees on this, but here is where the story fractures. The distance from Jerusalem to the northwest corner of Spain is nearly 4,000 kilometers. No text from the first 700 years of Christianity mentions James visiting Spain. Not Paul's letters, not the early church fathers, not a single source. The tradition first appears in a 7th century Latin text called the Breviarium Apostolorum. 600 years after James died, someone wrote that he had preached in Spain. That is not early evidence. That is mythology filling a gap. And the timing of the discovery in 829 is itself suspicious. In the 9th century, the Christian kingdoms of northern Spain were small and besieged. The Umayyad Caliphate controlled most of the peninsula. What the Asturian kingdom needed was not just an army. It needed a saint, a patron who could unify fractured Christian kingdoms under one banner. A discovery of apostolic bones did exactly that. King Alfonso II immediately endorsed the find and ordered a chapel built. Within a generation, Santiago de Compostela was the most important pilgrimage site in Western Europe after Rome. The pilgrimage did not grow by accident. It was engineered. Kings granted tax exemptions to towns that built pilgrim hostels along the route. Monasteries competed for the right to house and feed the travelers. 4 great routes from France alone funneled travelers towards Santiago. Each route generated wealth for every village it passed through. The bones under the altar were not just sacred. They were an economic engine. By the 12th century, the Codex Calixtinus served as Europe's first travel guide. It described every stop, every danger, every miracle attributed to St. James. It was propaganda, disguised as a guidebook. And it stayed that way for centuries. No one questioned it when the bones disappeared entirely. In 1589, the English privateer Sir Francis Drake attacked the Galician coast. The Archbishop of Santiago ordered the bones hidden to prevent their capture. They were sealed inside a wall somewhere beneath the cathedral, and then no one could find them again. For nearly 300 years, Spain's holiest relics were simply lost. In 1879, Canon Antonio L. Lopez Ferrero found bones behind the high altar. He declared them the lost relics of St. James. The Pope sent physicians. They examined the bones visually and declared them authentic, but there was no way to test their age in 1884. The papal declaration was a statement of faith, not a statement of science. Decades passed before anyone attempted a serious forensic analysis. When researchers finally studied the bones using modern osteological methods. The results confirmed what anatomy had already suggested. 3 distinct individuals, different biological ages at death, different skeletal robusticity. One set of remains belonged to someone significantly older than the other 2. The remains also showed signs consistent with an Iberian burial context, not a 1st century Eastern Mediterranean one. Strontium isotope analysis works because the geology of every region leaves a signature in bone. The food you eat and the water you drink absorb minerals from local bedrock. Those minerals become part of your bones. They stay there permanently. Galician granite produces a strontium signature distinctly different from Galilean limestone. A person who grew up near the Sea of Galilee would carry that limestone signature for life. Teeth are even more reliable. Enamel forms in childhood and never remodels. Your teeth are a permanent record of where you lived as a child. If the Santiago bones carry an Iberian childhood signature, they cannot belong to someone born in Galilee. The technology to answer this question has existed for over 20 years, but no one has been granted access to the relics to perform it. Meanwhile, isotope studies on other Iberian medieval burials have produced clear results. Researchers know exactly what 4th century Iberian bone chemistry looks like. They know what 1st century Eastern Mediterranean bone chemistry looks like. One test could distinguish between them. That test has never been allowed. Soil mineral traces in the bone matrix pointed to someone who had spent their life in Western Europe, not someone who grew up fishing on the Sea of Galilee. And then came the question no one in Santiago wanted to hear. If the bones aren't those of St. James, whose are they? One answer has haunted historians for over a century. His name was Priscillian. Priscillian was a 4th century bishop from Soldevilla in central Spain. He preached an ascetic form of Christianity that alarmed the Roman Church establishment. His followers rejected material wealth and practiced extreme spiritual discipline. The church considered him a heretic. And in 385, they had him killed. Priscillian was executed in Trier, in what is now Germany. He was the first person in Christian history to be executed for heresy by a secular court. And his followers did something extraordinary afterward. They brought his body back to Galicia, where he had his largest following. They buried him with honor in a stone tomb on a hillside in the northwest. A heretic's tomb venerated by his followers, hidden from the church that killed him. 400 years later, a hermit found bones on a hillside in Galicia, and a bishop called them Saint James. The Priscillian hypothesis proposes that the bones in Santiago Cathedral are not apostolic at all. They belong to a heretic the church itself condemned to death. The geographic match is almost exact. Priscillian's followers were concentrated in Galicia. The tomb was in the right place at roughly the right time. The dating gap between Priscillian's burial and the 9th century discovery fits perfectly. 400 years is exactly the kind of gap that turns a known burial into a mysterious discovery. Archaeologists have found physical traces of Priscillianist worship in Galicia. Carved stones bearing Priscillianist symbols have been recovered from sites across the northwest. 4th century burials in Galicia show a distinct funerary tradition. The bodies were oriented differently from standard Roman Christian burials. Priscillianist followers practiced ascetic rituals that left archaeological signatures. Pottery, metalwork, and inscriptions confirm that the Northwest was a Priscillianist stronghold. The density of evidence is highest within a 30-kilometer radius of Santiago itself. That is the epicenter. That is where Priscillian's followers were most active. And that is exactly where a hermit supposedly discovered mysterious bones 4 centuries later. The stratigraphy beneath the cathedral is consistent with late Roman occupation. The foundations sit on top of what appears to be a much earlier structure, a structure old enough to predate the cathedral by at least 5 centuries. Some archaeologists believe this was originally a Roman-era mausoleum, a burial chamber for someone important, someone whose followers venerated the site, not an apostle shipped 4,000 kilometers, a local leader buried by his people. The wealth flowed in both directions. Towns grew, trade routes multiplied, memory fades, records disappear, and then someone finds bones. The English theologian Henry Chadwick was among the first modern scholars to lay out the case. His argument was simple. No credible evidence connects James to Spain. Abundant evidence connects Priscillian's followers to the exact location where the bones were found. But here is where the story gets complicated, because the church pushed back. The Vatican's response to the Priscillian hypothesis has been consistent for decades. They argue that the tradition is older than the surviving texts suggest. Absence of evidence, they say, is not evidence of absence. Perhaps texts existed that mentioned James in Spain and were simply lost. Perhaps oral traditions carried the story before anyone wrote it down. And the church points to the 3 sets of remains as evidence, not contradiction. They claim the other 2 individuals were James's disciples. Tradition names them Athanasius and Theodore, 2 disciples who supposedly accompanied James. 3 bones, 3 people, 3 saints. The story holds together, unless you ask the bones themselves. Because here is the critical gap in the church's defense. No comprehensive radiocarbon dating of the Santiago bones has ever been published. No peer-reviewed ancient DNA analysis has been performed. The church has not allowed the kind of testing that could settle this. The reliquary remains under ecclesiastical control. Access requires church permission, and that permission has not been granted for the kind of analysis that could date the remains definitively. Modern ancient DNA laboratories can extract genetic material from bones over 10,000 years old. Galicia's soil is rich with medieval burial sites that have been properly excavated and dated. Dozens of burials in the immediate region have been radiocarbon dated successfully. Scene 170C video, photorealistic cinematic documentary style matching reference image. Medium shot of a researcher at a computer comparing radiocarbon dates from multiple Galician burial sites. A spreadsheet of dates and sites visible on the monitor. Charts showing date distributions. Cold blue-white screen glow mixed with desk lamp light. Camera slowly pushing in toward the screen. Scholarly atmosphere. Shallow depth of field. Film grain texture. The methodology is proven. The question is only whether it will be applied to Santiago. Scene 170D, talking head. The character says every other important burial in Spain has been scientifically dated, except this one. Every other important burial in Spain has been scientifically dated, except this one. The petrous bone, the densest bone in the human skull, preserves DNA longest. One fragment the size of a rice grain can yield a full ancient genome. That genome would reveal biological sex, geographic ancestry, and population affiliation. Principal component analysis would place the individual on a map of ancient populations. First century Galileans cluster with Levantine Bronze Age populations. 4th century Iberians cluster with Western European Iron Age groups. The difference is obvious. Ancient DNA has already resolved dozens of similar identity disputes across Europe. Richard III was identified in a Leicester car park using exactly these methods. If a king buried under a parking lot can be identified, so can bones under an altar. The technology is ready. The laboratories are waiting. The bones are right there. This means the strongest claim in Spanish Christianity rests on faith alone, not on science, not on tested evidence, on 1,200 years of tradition. And tradition in science is not evidence. But here is where the honest scientist pauses, because the Priscillian hypothesis is exactly that, a hypothesis. It has strong circumstantial support, but it has not been proven either. No one has extracted DNA from the Santiago bones and matched it to a known Priscillianist burial. No one has published a radiocarbon date that places the bones in the 4th century. The hypothesis is built on location, timing, and the absence of any better explanation. That is compelling, but it is not conclusive. The honest answer is that we don't know whose bones these are. What we do know is this: they are not conclusively 1st century. They are not conclusively from the Eastern Mediterranean. They belong to multiple people, not one apostle. Whoever declared them authentic was a pope, not a laboratory. But here is what makes this story larger than one cathedral and one set of bones. The Camino de Santiago created one of the first pan-European cultural networks. For 1,000 years, it connected villages, cities, and kingdoms. Hospitals, churches, roads, and entire towns were built along its routes. The pilgrimage became a highway for ideas, languages, art, and trade. Romanesque architecture spread along the Camino. So did music, literature, and legal systems. It was, in many ways, the original European Union, built on a pilgrimage road, and it was built entirely on the belief that a saint was buried at the end of it. Today, that pilgrimage is bigger than ever. Over 300,000 people complete the journey every year. Most of them know nothing about the Priscillian hypothesis. They come for the walk, for the transformation, for the community, and most of them never descend into the crypt to see the bones. The experience of the pilgrimage has outgrown the relic that inspired it. But for Spain, the question is not just spiritual, it is economic. 200 million euros flow through the Camino economy each year. Hotels, restaurants, guide services, gear shops, transport companies, an entire regional economy depends on the continuing belief that the journey is worth making. Questioning the bones is not just a historical debate. It is an economic threat, and that creates a conflict of interest that science cannot ignore. The regional government of Galicia has no incentive to fund research that might undermine the claim. The church has no incentive to open the reliquary to independent laboratories, and the pilgrims themselves have no incentive to ask uncomfortable questions. Everyone benefits from not looking too closely. But other cases show what happens when science is allowed to examine relics freely. In 1988, the Catholic Church allowed radiocarbon dating of the Shroud of Turin. 3 independent laboratories tested samples and all reached the same conclusion, dated to between 1260 and 1390 AD. Medieval, not ancient. The church accepted the results publicly, and the world moved on. People still visit. People still believe. But the science is on the record. Transparency did not destroy the relic's cultural significance. It enriched the conversation. In the 1950s, the Vatican allowed excavation beneath St. Peter's Basilica. Archaeologists found a burial site beneath the high altar in a 1st century Roman necropolis. They found bones. But the scientific analysis raised more questions than it answered. The bones were identified as belonging to a robust man in his 60s or 70s, consistent with Peter, perhaps, but hardly proof. The Vatican declared the bones authentic. Independent scientists remained skeptical. In Naples, the blood of San Gennaro liquefies 3 times a year in a public ceremony. Spectroscopic analysis has suggested the substance may not be blood at all. Researchers proposed it could be a thixotropic gel. The church refused further testing. The pattern repeats across Europe. Claims are made, testing is limited or denied, and when testing is finally allowed, the results consistently challenge the attribution. Fragments of the true cross have been radiocarbon dated in several studies. Every tested sample has returned a medieval date. Not one has been 1st century. The evidence is consistent. When relics are tested, they tend to be younger than claimed. The pattern holds across every major European relic collection. Santiago could do the same, but it chooses not to. And Santiago is not the only case. Across Europe, cathedrals hold relics that have never been scientifically tested. Bones attributed to Peter in Rome, the head of John the Baptist in multiple cities, fragments of the true cross distributed across dozens of churches. Most of these attributions are medieval, and most have never been tested. The Santiago case is simply the most consequential because an entire pilgrimage tradition hangs on it, and an entire national identity was forged in its name. The Reconquista lasted 700 years. Santiago was its battle cry. Kings who claimed divine mandate pointed to the bones under the altar as proof. If those bones are not apostolic, the entire theological justification for centuries of war dissolves. Not in reality. History happened regardless, but in narrative. Spain told itself a story for 12 centuries, and the bones were the proof. What makes the Santiago case unique is the scale of what rests on the answer. Other disputed relics are curiosities. Santiago is a foundation stone, a cathedral, a pilgrimage, a military tradition, a national saint, a regional economy. In 1985, UNESCO designated the old town of Santiago a World Heritage Site. The Camino routes themselves were added to the list in 1993. That heritage status protects the cultural significance, regardless of what the bones turn out to be. The pilgrimage has become something larger than its origin story. The Spanish government still designates July 25th as a national holiday honoring Santiago, a feast day for a saint whose relics have never been independently verified. Scene 260C, video photorealistic cinematic documentary style matching reference image, wide shot of a festive street celebration in Santiago de Compostela on Santiago Day. Fireworks exploding above the cathedral, crowds filling the illuminated plaza, traditional Galician folk musicians playing in the foreground, warm festive lighting mixed with cool firework bursts. Cameras slowly panning across the celebration, lively atmospheric joy. Film grain texture every year. The nation celebrates, and every year the bones remain untested. Scene 260D image, photorealistic cinematic documentary style matching reference image, medium shot of a framed photograph on a government office wall showing the Spanish king making the traditional pilgrimage embrace of the Santiago statue in the cathedral. Beside it, a formal portrait of the current monarch. Warm interior office lighting, subject positioned right of frame. Shallow depth of field f at 2.8, warm official tones. High detail vertical bar, pan right Spanish monarchs still perform the ritual embrace of the Santiago statue, scene 260E. Talking head. The character says, a tradition that connects modern Spain to a 9th century bishop's unverified claim. A tradition that connects modern Spain to a 9th century bishop's unverified claim. Scene 260F video. Photorealistic cinematic documentary style matching reference image. Wide shot of school children on a field trip inside Santiago Cathedral. A teacher pointing up at the architecture, while the children look around in wonder, warm natural light from high windows. Camera slowly tracking past the group. Youthful curiosity contrasting with ancient stone, warm amber tones. Film grain texture school textbooks present the Santiago tradition as historical fact. Scene 260G image. Photorealistic cinematic documentary style matching reference image. Close, up of a Spanish school history textbook page showing a chapter on the Reconquista with an illustration of Santiago Matamoros and text describing the discovery of the relics. The book on a classroom desk, harsh overhead fluorescent lighting, subject centered in frame, shallow depth of field FET 2.8, neutral color palette, high detail vertical bar zoom in the next generation, inherits the story without ever being told the bones have not been tested. People walk for grief, for clarity, for challenge, for community. Many who walk are not religious at all. The road itself has become the sacred thing, not the bones at the end of it. But for historians, the question still matters, because if the bones are Priscillians, it means the church built a saint's cult on a heretic's grave. It means centuries of crusade were justified by a misidentification, not a deliberate fraud necessarily, but a mistake with staggering consequences. 700 years of religious war, millions of lives shaped by one bishop's declaration. The fall of Granada, the expulsion of Jews and Muslims, the Inquisition, all of it built on bones that have never been dated by a laboratory. And that is not an argument for or against the bones being genuine. It is simply an observation that the question remains open. Science has the tools to answer it. The question is whether anyone will let it. Radiocarbon dating would establish the century of death within decades. Isotope analysis would reveal the geographic origin of the individuals. Ancient DNA could determine biological sex, ancestry, and kinship between the three individuals. If the bones are first century Galilean, the science will show it. If they are 4th century Iberian, the science will show that too. Either way, the answer is inside the reliquary under the altar, and it has been sitting there for 1,200 years, waiting. A growing number of researchers have called for an international testing protocol. Independent laboratories, blind testing, published results, the same standard applied to the Shroud of Turin. The same standard that identified Richard III. The answer is behind that gate in a silver chest, under an altar. 1,200 years of faith, war, pilgrimage, and national identity. Here is what we know for certain. The bones in Santiago Cathedral belong to at least 3 people. No 1st century dating has been established for any of them. No textual evidence from the first 7 centuries connects James to Spain. The discovery served the political interests of the kingdom that announced it. And the church has not allowed independent, comprehensive scientific testing. None of this proves the bones are fake. But none of it proves they are real either. Spain built a nation on this grave, an identity, an economy, a pilgrimage that shaped European civilization, and it all rests on bones that science has never been allowed to identify. If the Camino has taught us anything, it is that the journey matters more than the destination. But the question at the destination still deserves an answer. Whose bones are really under that altar? That is the question Spain has been avoiding for 1,200 years, and it is the question that only science can finally answer.